could easily recount the many dreadful stories told by survivors, but that would spoil your reading of the great books on the subject. So instead, I'm going to recount the stories of the men, Wheeling men, some of whom lived to tell their tales of that horrible experience, and some who didn't. I'll talk about the books that I recommend on this subject, but the one that I particularly like, Jean found online. It's free. It's under Google Books. It's called The Smoked Yak. And it's not about the Sultana as much as it's about life in the prisons. So that's one of the rather moving books, startling books, I should say. Okay, Anthony Craig was a tailor in Wheeling. He had 4 children, and he enlisted when he was 44, then re-enlisted in Battery D, 1st West Virginia Light Artillery in 1864, and he listed his age as 37. He drowned after the explosion of the Sultana. William Crudis was from Newcastle, England. He was naturalized in Wheeling in 1848 and listed his occupation as a teamster. He enlisted on March 12, 1864, but apparently didn't appear for service. He was arrested and imprisoned in the Athenaeum, then sent to his unit on March 13th. He was captured near Lynchburg and sent to Andersonville. According to an article in the Memphis Argus dated April 28, 1865, William Crudis was, quote, picked up while almost in the agonies of death. He was holding to the limb of a partially submerged tree with such force that the limb had to be cut before they could get his body onto a raft. He was taken by a local man to his house, but died before he could reach the hospital. He was wearing an identification label, which someone must have written for him, as he was only able to sign his enlistment papers with an X. Among the lucky survivors was Henry C. Foster. He was a brickmaker. His father was well known in Wheeling as the stagecoach agent and held that position until the coming of the railroad to Wheeling in 1852. While home on furlough, he married Margaret Boring, whose father was a close friend of his. He was captured at the Battle of Newmarket and sent to Andersonville. He was rescued 5 hours after the explosion. After the war, he took Sarah Jones as his wife, without divorcing his first wife. He applied for a war pension in January of 1886 and stated, I incurred scurvy about 3 months after the time I was captured from want of proper food and exposure while in prison. He went on to say that he was presently working as a carpenter, but he incurred debility or weakness of the whole system, which he blamed on both the imprisonment and the disaster. He was denied the pension, and he died in 1890 of pneumonia, and he's buried in Mount Wood Cemetery. His widow, Sarah, applied for the pension, and in a statement by a fellow officer, it was reported that he, quote, he had married Dot Boring when she was known as a common prostitute. He further stated that he must have been drunk or crazy to have married that woman, and that he had been robbed of his money, and he charged her and her father with the same. He said while he was in the service that he would never live with that woman. A statement from Dot Boring Foster said she was 14 when she married Henry, and that her father told her that Henry had, quote, nursed me when I was a child. I have no idea what that means. I think it means he was her babysitter, but you know, she was 14, though. It's a little strange. Sarah was denied the pension. George C. Loy was yet another Wheeling survivor of the Sultana. He served with Carlin's Battery and was captured at Hanging Rock Gap in Virginia in 1864 and sent to Andersonville. After the war, he worked as a blacksmith and machinist at the Bel Air nail mill, but dismissed from his job for intemperance. He had a paralytic stroke in 1872, and he was treated for delirium tremens, a symptom of alcoholic abuse. He was only 35 when he died, and he's buried at Mount Wood. In a letter home from Camp Parole, that's what he called it, it was actually Camp Fisk, dated April 1865, George wrote, "We have had a hard time in the Confederacy and suffered everything that man could possibly do from hunger, cold, and thirst. And since last month, 1 year ago, there has died in Andersonville Stockade Prison alone 13,000 Union men. George Lloyd jumped into the water after the explosion on the Sultana and spent about 3.5 hours in the water before being rescued. He was unconscious and was taken to Washington Hospital in Memphis. From there, he wrote his family, "Everything was confused. Hundreds were blown high in the air and came down burned and mangled beyond description. Men were seen tying life preservers around their wives and children and throwing them overboard in hopes of their being saved. Around the boat in the water was a mass of human beings, some in their death struggles, drowning, others who otherwise might have reached shore. The screams and groans of men, women, and children on that ill-fated boat I shall never forget." George mentioned a slight wound from a piece of wood as a result of the explosion, but later the letter in which he wrote this was changed to read a severe wound. And a tube was placed before the 3.5 hours that he spent in the water. He was treated for a stroke, a rheumatism of his left side. He died in 1877. His widow was denied the pension. Alexander Manners, which is 22 when he enlisted in the fall of 1861. He was captured at the Battle of Newmarket in May of 1864 and sent to Andersonville. He died as a result of the explosion. James McHenry's residence in Wheeling can only be assumed from his site of enlistment in Company G of the 1st Regiment of West Virginia Light Artillery in Wheeling in May of 1861. He was a blacksmith and toolmaker. At Salem, Virginia, now West Virginia, in January of 1863, he was injured by an explosion of a caisson full of ammunition. He was hurled against a tree and taken to Grafton Hospital, where he remained for 4 months. When released, he re-enlisted, this time with Battery D, 1st West Virginia Light Artillery. He was captured at Hunter's Raid on Lynchburg, Virginia, and sent to Andersonville. When the Sultana exploded, he suffered injuries to his bones, limbs, a fractured skull, left temple, right shoulder, and arm. He was at Washington Hospital in Memphis for 2 months, was discharged in Clarksburg, and moved to Chicago, where he lived in the Soldiers' Home. His pension application was dropped when he died in 1893.